Good morning. Good morning, everyone. It's lovely to see you all. It's great to see numbers already appearing in the attendee list. You never quite know if we're just going to be talking to ourselves on a Monday morning. I'd be quite happy to, obviously. But it's much nicer if we've got lots of other people to be talking to as well. Good morning, Matthew. Hello. It's lovely to see you.
Hi, Nina. Hi, everyone. Hope you're all well.
Thank you ever so much. Now, I get the privilege of jumping in on a Pretties webinar today. So I've got loads of questions. I was just saying to Matthew, I'm probably being over ambitious about trying to ask as many questions around risk and governance. And we know that we had a huge number of people registering for this webinar this morning. So it's obviously a topic that is pretty high on people's agendas at the moment. I think everything feels like it's moving very fast. There's an increased level of scrutiny. There's more reputational risk. So I've got lots of questions, and we had quite a few questions asked in advance as well. So thank you for that. We're going to try and weave those in as we go through the conversation today. But for if anyone has never heard me speaking on a webinar before or seen me, I'm Nina Metson. I'm the MD of Waddington Brown. We're an HR recruiter and consultant in the east of England, and like I said, I feel very privileged to have been asked onto a Pretties webinar this morning. So thank you, Matthew. I really do appreciate it.
It's always a pleasure, Nina. It's always a pleasure. I think this is called a takeover, isn't it? Isn't that the modern?
Yeah, I think. Absolutely.
Yeah, we've got a takeover. Look at us, zeitgeist.
Don't let me do your social media. That'd be terrible. That would be. Now, if we're talking about risk and governance, no, we're not. Okay. Before we dive into some details, let's set a bit of context, shall we? So, are we, from your perspective, from what you see and what you are experiencing with clients, are organisations underestimating risk, and why, if they are? Yeah. And what are you seeing more of now than perhaps you might have been seeing a few years ago? Okay. What's surfacing?
Yeah, I think it's very difficult always to sort of be generic about this. So yeah, some organizations are underestimating risk, some are overestimating it, and some are looking at the wrong risks. I think that's where we stand, and many of them, of course, are getting it right as well. So we've got a complete mixture. I think there is, for me, the most interesting area is that idea of misidentification of risk. I think there is an awful lot of focus on are we going to a tribunal, or are we going to lose at a tribunal? That's one of the main risks that I see in businesses, and that's partly because of the nature of my job, but also I think it's because that is seen as the end game for many things. I think the other thing I would say is that I think there is a need to look at what is coming down the line and what that is going to change in terms of the risk profile that organizations have, and how they are going to have to be looking at risk management, because there is an awful lot going on.
I mean, there's the things, like you say, there's the things that are surfaced, that the end game, if you like, but then there must be a whole raft of things that are perhaps not getting recorded, not even really being thought of yet as risk. Where do they tend to sit in an organisation?
Yeah, I think you're right, and I think one of the things we see more of than anything as a generic issue is most organisations now have great policies. You can go online, you can go to any number of sources, you can go to solicitors, you can go to HR consultants, whomever, and you can work on and get a really good set of policies and procedures. The risk comes in that they are not properly embedded in businesses, and the biggest, I'd say, generic risk we face is the fact that organizations are often doing something different to what they say they're going to do, and that's where it's sort of between the gaps, where on the one hand you've got great intentions, you've got great policies, and then you've got real life, and real life is pragmatic, real life is difficult, real life involves compromise, real life involves other people, and that's where you get the risk. And what I think we we have there is a sense that many issues don't actually surface because the informality with which they are being dealt with just means they go completely below the radar. And because they go below the radar, you can say, well, that's fine, we've solved the problem. But what it means is you don't get patterns building up. You don't see where the risk really is coming. And the second time is when actually they're not put to bed properly, where again, you think you've solved the problem. You think you've gone, right, okay, we've had a conversation with them. We've had a conversation with them. We know what's good. We are now good. We can get on with things. And then it comes back a few months later and it comes back worse. And it comes back with whomever has been involved in that, harking back to that previous issue, which you thought was resolved. So I think that's where it doesn't surface. It's that gap between intention and action.
Absolutely. But then you then find yourself sometimes in a situation, this relates to one of the questions that was asked in advance actually, about how do we balance the need for control in our HR processes with growing complexity, but without creating systems that are overly bureaucratic and counterproductive. And I think that they're, you know, like you just said, real life is not a slick process, you know, so that design principle around HR processes and governance, around designing for the common case rather than the exception. You know, I think what I often see is that a lot of processes in companies become bloated and over-engineered because the 5% of what really is complex and difficult is what you're designing for, is actually the majority of times it's 90, you know, the 95% is relatively straightforward if managed well. So
yeah,
is there an argument for tiered governance around, you know, a lightweight framework compared to actually then how you then escalate something?
Yeah,
and how you design the process accordingly?
Yeah, there can be. And I think to take one step further, we talk about great policies. We also talk about a really committed cohort of HR professionals who are making sure that these things are, you know, they're looking at their requirements. They're making sure those requirements are interpreted into policy, and they're trying to think of ways in which organisations are going to work with them. But the problem, and I think where you sometimes get over engineering is try to manage this problem is you've got managers who are expected to implement them, and actually you have a good manager doesn't have the problem employee in front of them and the handbook by their side constantly referring to one or the other. They're doing what they think works pragmatically in the moment, on the day, often with a completely different agenda to the agenda that was in place when the HR policy was written. And, you know, I think there's and this is a theme which we have constantly seen when we've been talking to clients about Employment Rights Act implementation, particularly around things such as the probationary period changes, etc. We've got to train the managers. We've got to make sure the managers understand this. And that seems to be a slightly forlorn intention in many organisations, that there just isn't the time to train manage. I keep on saying change. Is that a Freudian slip? Train managers properly on how to work with some of these things, how to nip in the bud without necessarily being non-compliant, and how to have a difficult conversation, how to make sure there is proper escalation. All of these things seem to be, you know, great in the policy, great in the procedure, but they don't seem to quite interpret into practice.
I mean, I've got some thoughts around why that might be, but I'm going to ask a polling question first, because I think it would be really useful at this point to see what's happening for people in their organisations. So we're going to bring up a first poll, which is, I would really like everyone who is tuned in to share their answer, please, around which best describes how your organisation currently identifies people-related risk. So are you being super proactive? Risks are identified and managed early. mostly proactive, a little bit of reactive work that's going on? Are you mostly reactive? Those issues are being picked up after they arise, or are you highly reactive and those risks are often missed until escalation? So if you would share your feelings about where you are in your organisation, that would be really helpful, especially because it helps Matthew and I obviously think about how we frame some of the conversation as we move through the time that we've got together today. We're getting some good votes in. This is good. This is good. More than got nearly, we've got 65% of the people that are on at the moment. That's great. Let's get a few more votes in just before we close that poll down and share the answers. Lovely. Let's just give that a few more seconds. Excellent. Right, the votes I think have slowed a little bit, so I think we'll end the poll there. So now, can I share the results? I'm going to click on share results and let's see what happens. So you're going to see, as you would probably suspect, that most people are sitting in the middle somewhere, where you've got that mixture of proactive and reactive. I think it's interesting that we've got a higher proportion than I perhaps would have thought, where people are still sitting in a mostly reactive world. You know, there's, we know that if we are always firefighting, then it's really hard to put in place the preemptive and risk mitigations that we would like to have. You know, you can't be doing both at the same time. So we want to try and get people into a position where they are able to be more proactive than reactive. Thank you very much for that. That goes back to the point then around if the argument is, or if people are saying we haven't got time to train managers, we haven't got time to do this, we haven't got time. From my perspective, if something matters enough to the right people in the organisation, then there is always time. And it comes down to, is it an important enough topic for the people who make decisions around what is expected of their employees to want to invest the time, effort, budget, and ring fence people to be able to do it? So then my question is around it's around the exposure of leaders to risk and how we encourage their thinking. Between one of the other questions that came in was actually around, a minute, let me bring it up because I think I want to get this wording right. There was a really interesting question around how do you move forward with leaders if they either do not see or do not understand the risks in the business? And I think that then comes down to a case of, is it about skill or is it about will? So from a legal perspective, how are you working with leaders at that top level so that they genuinely understand what's going on in their business?
Yeah. Well, and it is a really interesting question. When I saw it, I must admit I scratched my head about it quite a bit. I think there's, overall we can say, well, a leader has the obligation to ensure that risks are properly identified and properly managed. And to a certain extent, if they're not doing that correctly, or if they're not bothered about doing that, then the organisation is likely to fail. I think we see that a lot with successful, with commercially successful organisations, where actually it all becomes about shifting the boxes or getting the orders through the door, and everything else for a while then becomes sort of secondary to that. And I think at that point senior leaders can have their eyes off the ball. They can also have their eyes off the ball if at the other end of the spectrum where the organisation is struggling, and there's a day-to-day firefighting just to ensure that you can make payroll at the end of every month. So there's an awful lot for leaders to go to be able to cope with, and their bandwidth has to be very wide. I think there's one thing there, which is, okay, if I'm sitting there in HR, if I'm sitting there as someone who has a role to advise the board and to make sure that risks are brought to their attention, and then to advise us how to properly manage them, I've got to think, okay, what are the imperatives of the business? and how do I make sure that the risks I am bringing to the board are done in the context of the business. Number one, I think if you feel you've made your best efforts to raise those risks, to advise whomever you're advising about them, and it's being met with deaf ears, then you have a choice. And your choice is either to sit and stay with it and think, well, I'll do the best I can, or it's to recognize that you're going to have to go elsewhere. You know, because ultimately the leaders are the business who are the ones who will take the decisions, and there is only so much you can do. And I think many of us do sit with businesses which are we regard in many ways as imperfect, and we're there because, well, either it's something where we feel aligned to the job, or we feel aligned to the people, and we think we'll do the best we can. So I think, number one, you've got to understand what your leaders' priorities are at that particular time. Number two, you've got to understand what your framework looks like for raising those risks. And number three, you've got to recognize that ultimately, if what you're saying is falling on deaf ears, then it's falling on deaf ears, and that's not your fault. It's the leaders who are not listening.
It's really true. I mean, HR should never be the sole custodian of a risk that a leader's chosen, that you've informed a leader of, and they've chosen to ignore. You know, and I think that, but then I think that with that, there's still that need. So HR's obligations or HR's responsibilities. Yes, we absolutely have a responsibility to be commercially aware. How does the risks, the patterns that you've already talked about, how do they translate into a commercial risk? Because our leaders are far more likely to make a change, spend time, if we're talking their language. So from HR's responsibility is to frame things in a commercial way. You know, what matters, and understanding the way that we make money, save money, spend money, whatever it is in our organisations, it has to be translated into those terms around risk. But on the flip side of that, the escalation, if there is risk that is not being listened to or paid attention to, there might be an existing governance framework, but ultimately actually still maintaining a paper trail of that risk is still important, because actually that's protection for the future. If you have advised your leaders and they've chosen to not listen to it, you have still done the thing. Like I said, HR is not the custodian.
Exactly, and I think that's really important. And I think it's also important because you know, there is always nuance and increasing nuance with risk management. You know, one of the problems, and it's a bugbear of mine with tribunal litigation, for example, is that there is a decision which leads to a dismissal, and then 2 years later, if you're lucky, it's 2 years, it could be a lot longer, the tribunal is sitting there, and what they are constantly asking is, well, why did you do that? And okay, you did that, so why did you do that? And you say, because most of the time the answer is because I thought it was the right thing to do at the time. But the difficulty is that hindsight thinking gives you it gives everyone a completely different perspective to what you were going through. And tribunals are a very clear, and I think, you know, quite stark, for those of you who have been in a tribunal, quite a stark example of that. But there are others, and there are others coming through. So for me, I find myself using the word defensible more and more. Have we given ourselves a defensible position? So if we're looking at individual HR cases, have we given ourselves a defensible position? Have we explained at each stage why we have taken a particular decision, particularly if there is a departure from policy? If we're looking at it from the perspective of data protection compliance, again, have we recorded everything properly? Have we given ourselves that defensible position? Very, very important as we move into the AI world, and from that perspective. So increasingly, we have to look at frameworks and say, if someone comes and knocks on our door and asks us about this, do we have a defensible position? And I think that's probably some of the language to get a board used to. Is this defensible? And it's something we might come on to, but for me, it's becoming more and more acute because we are moving towards increasing regulation. We've got the Fair Work Agency coming, and that's going to be a biggie. The ICO are sort of skilling up, and that's going to be a biggie as well. We know we're going to have some kind of AI governance regulation in the future. These are all big issues where we have others coming to us and saying, why did you do that?
So if that risk has been documented, and more importantly has been documented as having been declined, is the organisation's exposure actually greater? Is the, you know, if the, then, so, you know, I did not know that happened, or, you know, the ignorance is a defence, whatever it might be, but actually the documented inaction, does that place greater risk for the organisation if that goes all the way through to?
Yeah, it can do quite clearly. If someone has come to you and said, we have, you know, we have a great big hole in our cybersecurity. This is now a real high risk for the organisation, and the board have noted it and not done anything, then that is going to be a major problem. But most risk is much more nuanced than that, and most of the risks that are being surfaced by HR teams are more nuanced than that. So I think it's then about saying, well, okay, you know, from a board perspective, we've heard what's said. We can see the risk. We're going to take these mitigation steps, or alternatively, actually at the moment, mitigation of this is not a priority. So we are going to live with it. So you can, you know, like I say, it's about giving yourself a defensible position. And you can certainly say, at this time, with the other priorities that were going on, when we looked at both the likelihood of this risk manifesting and the severity of that manifestation, we put it as low, and we were right to put it as low. And that, like I say, is in many cases, a defensible position. So yeah, it's surfacing it, dealing with it, and then noting it.
Absolutely. There's a question that was dropped in saying, can you tell us about our personal liability as HR professionals?
Yeah, on the whole, it's very limited. You know, you're there to do the company's work. So as a non-statutory director, you don't have a huge amount of liability. Now there are exceptions to that, and actually the exceptions are increasing. Obviously, under equality legislation, an individual can be liable for discrimination and/or harassment, and it's not unusual in a tribunal claim to see those individuals cited as respondents. Secondly, when you're looking at breaches of health and safety and similar, again, there can be some criminal liability there, although it's quite rare for that to be at anything other than board level. So there are some specific issues there, but on the whole, liability sits with the company and/or with the board. Now that's what we could say was the formal liability. What you've got to be careful of is where the informal liability sits, and that's where things such as reputational risk come in. And that's where you have to think about, you know, managing your own career as much as managing your current employer's career. You know, if you are in a situation where there is a high-profile tribunal claim and you are criticised in the judgment, then is that going to affect your employment prospects further down the line, or your reputation within the organisation further down the line? That's the kind of liability which I think also needs to be taken into account.
Certainly needs to be considered, and actually that point is a really good one around reputational risk, because when we talk about risk in the organisations, and you shared that point that often people jump straight towards tribunal, win or lose, that very binary decision, but actually what's the real cost that sits beyond a tribunal claim? What's the real cost within an organisation? We know there's a really protracted period in the lead up to tribunal. You know, what happens in that time, what happens afterwards, what's the real cost, and actually therefore additional risk that sits beyond those tribunals? Absolutely.
Reputational risk is is there, and it is quantifying. Now there's reputational risk for an individual, and there's reputational risk for a business, and that reputational risk can be existential. We've seen examples of, particularly around equality and diversity, of various investigations, various reports over the last few years, where the organisation has either only just survived or not survived, and individuals within those organisations have certainly had their reputations completely trashed as a result. So, you know, reputation is an existential risk. Now, when we put that together with tribunals, to a certain extent, you can think, well, tribunals, schmibunals, you know, is that a word?
It is now.
It is now. Tribunals, schmibunals. What do I mean by that? Well, first of all, an organisation of 500 employees will be unlucky if it gets a tribunal claim a year. Okay, so on the whole, got to take into account the industry and everything else. But tribunal claims are pretty rare. Now, the other thing about tribunal claims is that when they are made, they are settlable. Okay, normally it's just a sum of money, and it's just whether you as an organisation want to pay that money or whether you can afford to pay that money. But most of the time you can. So if you end up in a tribunal hearing right at the end of the process, normally it's because you've decided to do so. What we've got to be more careful is where an organisation doesn't have that agency, doesn't have that ability to be able to think, well, if a tribunal comes along, I can always settle it, and I can do so with an NDA. And increasingly, we've got those situations coming down the line. So I go back to what I said about data protection, for example. You'll all have been on the receiving end of a dreaded DSAR, I should imagine now. They are going up in number, and there is a regulatory process in the event that there is default of that process. We have the Fair Work Agency coming along, which is going to take over huge amounts of employment regulation, and that's going to change the landscape considerably. So I'll give you the example at the moment, and I've used this with clients. So holiday pay, right? Holiday pay is a nightmare. It's as soon as you've got anyone with any kind of overtime or variable earnings, then you've got to decide the extent to which you take that into account in the holiday pay you pay them. And there's a load of judgments, not always consistent with each other, quite complex and difficult to interpret. So what happens is you have an employer and you get them and you look at them and you say, I think you're about compliant. You may have an issue here, here, or here, but I think you're about compliance, so that's fine. Or you might have an organisation that comes along and says, look, we're not having anyone come to us and say that they've got a complaint about holiday. So even though you're telling us that we're not compliant, we're going to leave it there. We're going to leave it. And that's been a defensible position because effectively it's been down to an individual or a group of individuals to say, no, this isn't right. I'm going to tribunal and I am going to push this point. At which point you as an organisation can run many sort of tricks to either limit your liability or you can pay up. And that's the end of it. The Fair Work Agency is taking over enforcement of holiday pay, and they're just not going to take the same approach. You know, they're not going to allow that kind of voluntaristic, well, we as an employer will just see how it lands and see where we get to. If they come in and they find that you are not paying holiday pay properly, then you are going to be on the receiving end of regulatory action. And that is very, very different. So we're moving from that situation where many things have been voluntary and you comply and you look at risk from a voluntary compliance perspective to one where it's going to be mandatory. And that's happening all over the place.
I think it's a really interesting point, that shift in perspective around what we could do in a perfect world, but actually, like you say, we balance the risk, and you know, on balance, that's not a priority at the moment. We don't have a choice about this anymore. There's more questions coming in the chat, but I want to make sure that I also ask the ones that have. Can
I just make one more point before we move on to the questions, which is that the point I've just made about the move from that voluntary risk assumption to something far more mandatory is, I think, the most significant point I would make. Then, if you're going to take anything to the board, it's that there are a load of areas where we have had a choice, where we are no longer going to have a choice. And if the regulators come in and they look at this and they don't like it, we are stuffed. Okay, so there's some much harder messages you can give to boards around this.
So we don't want to alarm people, but then we need to strike the balance, don't we? Between we can take a pretty unedited version to our senior leaders and the board, because they really need to absolutely understand their potential exposure. So then how that then trickles down into the business, how that moves down into the business, when people are on a day-to-day basis thinking about doing their job, they're not thinking about risk and governance, and they're not thinking about all these things that, you know, the Fair Work Agency and compliance and changes in the law. They're busy doing the job that they've been employed to do. So we have to strike the balance between not alarming our workforce and making it feel like there is a draconian view or a bureaucratic view, but we still need to make that risk real. So how do we strike that balance? Some of the things that, you know, that struck me when we were talking about this and we were prepping for this session, we were talking around, yes, there needs to be a risk register, but we also need to be able to tell a story that sits behind that. You know, we need to have data, like you say, patterns. What is the pattern?
Yeah.
But we also need to connect that to human experience. So when we're talking about our then general population, our line managers, our employees, and we don't want to perhaps sort of add more layers of fear, whatever it might be, how do we strike that balance in a way that matters to them?
Yeah, I think, well, what we do is we separate out what they need to know from what they don't need to know. So take my example of holiday pay again for a minute. An operational manager day to day does not need to know that. That should be a conversation between HR and the board, because all that an operational manager needs to do is to make sure that the job is being done and whatever records are necessary to make sure someone's being paid are sent through to them. So first of all, what can we do to make the focus clearer and easier? We then come down to what individual managers know. What do we know about training and making managers understand, you know, some of these issues? Scare stories don't work. Telling managers what happens in a tribunal doesn't work. Telling them what the compensation bill could be doesn't work. It is just about, you know, there seems to be this sense of scaring people, which seems to be counterproductive. So I think it goes back to what I'm saying about this idea that you've got a policy and you've got a gap at the moment, which is where managers come in and do what they see as pragmatic rather than doing what is to the letter of the policy. Now, the obvious thing there, first of all, is, well, make your policy, and it goes back to your earlier point, Nina, make your policies as easy as possible to comply with. And that would suggest that you make them fairly vague and flexible. Secondly, there has to be training. And there has to be training around the things that matter. And I'll give you another example. So for years, we've had an issue around performance management. And if we look at that in the context of an early years employee, so someone who's been with you for less than 2 years, 2 years has always been, well, it's been the magic number for a while now. You might let them through their probationary period, because their probationary period is 6 months and they still haven't acquired statutory rights. And that's been relatively low risk, yeah, because you can allow a manager to have a soft conversation, to give an employee the benefit of the doubt, maybe give them the benefit of the doubt because actually they don't want a tough conversation with that individual. But give them the benefit of the doubt because actually you know that if they're still not quite where they need to be in a year's time, you can still terminate their employment relatively easily. Yeah, that's changing. The risk around that is changing with, the risk around probationary periods is changing with the move to 6 months unfair dismissal qualifying periods. All of a sudden, that probationary period becomes much, much more important and how probationary conversations are handled becomes much, much more important. So we've got to address that with our managers. It's no good just writing a new probationary policy, which make sure anyone is properly assessed within 6 months, because we know managers don't follow that. We know managers will squirm their way through. They will delay, they will book holidays themselves, they will find a meeting, they will do anything they can to avoid having a difficult probationary conversation with someone. Now, we've got to find a way of changing that, and we've got to do that specifically with the managers. And I don't know whether that is purely to do competency training, or whether it's muscle memory. Maybe we've got to sit them down and have some hard conversations and facilitate some of those hard conversations for them. Maybe we've got to sort of explain more about the consequences for the business. Actually, in a year's time, if that individual hasn't been properly managed early on, they're still going to be there, and that's going to have significant consequences for the performance of their team. But that kind of thing, I think, needs to be thought about and changed. Does that sort of answer your question, Nina?
Yeah, it does. And also that then leads into that question, and there was a question that came in advance as well, which was around manager capability more broadly, because this shift towards when people are working from home, and it's still a question that's being had around how do we, what's the risk around a decline in productivity, for example. We might be looking at continuous monitoring, or how we are observing or tracking what people are doing when they're not working in the office. How do you balance the two? Now, from my perspective, I always feel like, actually, if you've got people in a hybrid or a working from home environment, then it becomes far less important around, are they sat at their desk, to have they delivered what we have agreed they need to deliver. And therefore, actually, the way that you structure your team, so as a line manager, your team's objectives will shift, because it's about output rather than presenteeism, for example. And actually that is something that needs to be, that's a real shift for a lot of line managers, because they haven't necessarily been trained themselves in that way of working, that it's based on outcome rather than visibility. I think it's interesting then around line managers' fear or nervousness becomes around how they control their team and how they work with their team and how they have conversations with their team. Is there a legal standpoint around employee monitoring? Where's the risk that sits around that for people?
Yeah, and again, it's one of these ones which is worth understanding, and how you sort of take that on board, because it goes back to this idea of what's the defensible position. So let's think about it. First of all, you've got to understand where the potential risks are here. We've got a data protection issue. So we've got to take into account data protection. We've got to have our lawful basis for processing. We've got to have transparency in our privacy information notices, etc. So we've got to get that level of compliance right. We've then got to make sure that we are properly understanding this from an employee welfare and well-being perspective, because monitoring is stressful. So have we done our health and safety risk assessments, for example? We've then got to understand what we do with the results, and we've got to train managers to understand what to do if whatever the monitoring is produces results which are outside of variance. So we've got to take it from that perspective as well. We've then got to ask ourselves, what do we actually do with the results? What procedure should we be following with the outcomes, the outputs of all of that? So we have to
get a ton of data, but what are you going to do with it?
Yeah, exactly. So we've got to look at it in a very a sort of granular way. We've got to have in mind what the legislation is. We've got to have in mind what our other legal duties are, and then we've got to understand how people work. And I think that's the only way to do something like monitoring. And we've also got to be bold, and we've got to say, actually, if we've gone through those exercises and we've come to the conclusion that monitoring is a bit intrusive and actually we're not sure what the benefits are, then you've got to say, so let's not do it. actually we're not going to get what we can, because a lot of risk management is about what benefit you're going to get for the potential harm that you may be taking on. So that needs to be looked at as well. I do a lot of data protection law, a lot of employment related data protection law, and the concept of the impact assessment in data protection law is a really strong one. And to have a properly formulated impact assessment process is a really good idea. And I think it can, in your example, Nina, of monitoring, it can actually morph from pure data protection into other areas, which I think is a really important way of doing it.
So before companies go down that route, actually, I'm looking at it from the flip side, which is around how our managers think about the work that's being done, and changing that perspective from activity, being really busy, to actually the outcomes that we need, is actually probably the first step to managing risk before you even go down the route of monitoring employees. It's the sticky carrot.
What are you trying to achieve? What are you going to communicate around what you're trying to achieve? Absolutely.
Let's bring up a second poll, shall we, so that we can ask again the people that are in the chat and in the audience about their thoughts on these things. So the question that we've got for you here is, where does accountability for people risk tend to break down in your organisation? We've talked a lot in this section around making leaders aware, making the board aware, making line managers aware, what HR's responsibility is within it. But where generally, and I appreciate it's a nuanced question because it's never always going to be the same, but if you have had that breakdown around risk and governance in your organisation that's led to an escalation of issues, where does it generally sit? So I'm just going to let the people that are on the session, it's lovely to see so many. I'm looking at the attendee numbers. It's fantastic. Thank you very much, everyone, for logging in this morning live. We really do appreciate it. To give your answer to this particular question, we will just let a few more come in before we end the voting on it. It'll be very interesting to see the results. What we're going to move on to in this next section is some of the specifics. There's been some really good questions that have come in. We also obviously want to make sure we talk a bit about AI as well. So we'll touch on some of those topics in the next section. Right, we're going to end the voting there, and we're going to share some results. Lovely. Line manager capability. Poor old line managers. We do ask a lot of them, but I think that in every single organisation, they are the touchstone. They're the lightning rod. What does our culture look and feel like flows through our line managers. How comfortable are we with risk and escalating things? It flows through our line managers. Now the line managers need the support and the structure that sits behind it, but ultimately so much of it flows through what they're doing. Now, one of the things that I had made a note to talk about was actually some behavioural stuff that sits behind line manager behaviours and work, and it's a psychological thing that it is around visibility, because we know that generally human beings like to feel that they're part of something. They like to feel that they are part of the majority. I do get that there will always be the minority who don't, but generally people want to feel like they're part of the majority. Some of the psychological tricks that get used when it comes to marketing and purchasing is to actually demonstrate the percentage of people, or the percentage of customers, or the percentage of visitors that will do a certain action. So that could be something like, if you go into a hotel room, for example, you will see a sign in your bathroom that says 75% of our hotel guests reuse their towels. Or you will get 4 out of 5 visitors use contactless to pay for something. Or you could internally have something like 70% of managers accessed this part of the internet last month to read about such and such. If you share that information, now I will always come at it from a comms perspective. For those of you who know me, you know my background is in employee engagement and internal comms. If you're working with your internal communicators in your organisation, sharing the behaviours of people encourages more of that behaviour. So if you are talking about the fact that, more than half of our managers sat down with HR last month just to talk about what's going on in their teams, whatever it, you can pull that information out and share it with people, either in conversation or as part of a regular rhythm of communication from HR. And this is one of the other points that I would always make about HR's responsibility, is to be visible in the organisation at times when it's not just about solving a problem. The visibility that you have in an organisation, the responsibility that you have to be having those conversations. If you're only ever seen when there's a problem, then people will assume that there's problems. So having conversations in HR or between HR and comms about how you parcel up some of that data, those patterns that you were talking about earlier, Matthew, and sharing more of that behaviour creates behaviour. And I think that's an important point.
I think it's exactly right, and it was something which I have been thinking about, because I think too many of the natural indicators or the relevant the indicators we've been useful are coming too late down the line. So grievances, exits, settlement agreements, some organisations, big organisations, tribunals, they're all very much after the event. And actually, when you start to think about it, you think, right, okay, what do we need to do? What do we measure? Well, proportion of individuals, can be managers, can be others, who have undertaken X, Y, and Z training. Looking at organisations which have, looking at teams, saying which teams appear to exercise or to demonstrate good behaviours, whether that is few grievances, few disciplinaries, people being on time, etc., etc. And I actually think you could put things such as a manager regularly speaking with HR, a regular catch up between a manager and HR, as being one of those. Which managers seek me out just for a general chat? Which ones keep me apprised of what's going on in their teams? That kind of thing actually, I think, is increasingly relevant, because it allows you to look at positive behaviours and try to then use those positive behaviours elsewhere. So yeah, if you've got 10 teams in a business, each one with a team leader, then why not put out a figure that says HR statistics, these 5 managers have met with me each month for the past quarter, these 5 haven't, that kind of thing, I think is really increasingly valuable.
Those leading indicators are so important in terms of the risk. Like we were saying before with that polling question, where lots and lots of people are sitting in a reactive world. Yeah. Actually, even before you try and move things into a more proactive process, what are some of those leading indicators that would help tell you where those key points are coming from?
Exactly. You can think of sickness absence, for example. You could say, right, well, we'll monitor sickness absence, but actually monitoring which managers are fulfilling their return to work interview functions is probably gives you more information and more relevant information than actual sickness numbers.
And I think there's also one of those tests that can be done to help move you into a more proactive world is around stress testing your existing escalation route before there's a big issue.
Yeah.
If you actually say, well, if this is our policy, let's properly stress test it, like we've done. We should all be doing business continuity exercises, all those things of what happens if.
Yeah.
And actually, is there a point where we know that we've written it down on paper, but the reality is it simply would not work like that?
Yeah.
Before we find ourselves in the real world.
Absolutely agree. And, you can do that. And actually, that can be a convincer for the board as well. If you say, right, okay, well, we're gonna model we can't get the board to engage, so we're going to model a sort of, a large public fallout between a senior manager and somebody else. What does that look like? What do we need to do? Not necessarily what's our risk, but what will we need to do? Who will we need to engage to make sure that this works? That's another way I think you can try and convince a team. It's very obviously very common in cybersecurity now, but actually doing it in other areas is very important.
Absolutely, yeah. Let's talk a bit about AI, because I mean, I live in a world, and I'm sure that many of you do as well, where I feel absolutely bombarded by what I should be doing, what I shouldn't be doing, about who should I be listening to, what tools do I need. It just, how we've got two things, I think, in HR, where it's how do we use AI with a governance framework within our business, but then also what's the risk of AI coming into our world, the potential new employees, or how our existing employees use AI. I've got some thoughts around HR governance, but I'm interested to hear what's surfacing for you from a legal perspective around that.
Yeah, I think again, trying to keep at the governance level, we're it's an area with my data protection hat on, which is is of real interest, because you can't now do data protection without doing AI and AI governance. So that's sort of where it's at for me at the moment. And what are we seeing? Well, we're seeing a number of things. I think the technology is moving so fast, and trying to keep up with the technology, I think for anyone, is too much. So what does that mean from governance? It means you've just got to acknowledge that the speed is there, and ensure that as far as you can, your governance structure is set up to be able to manage that speed and accommodate that speed. Number one. Number two, there is a lot of regulation coming down the line, even if it's coming in rather oblique ways. But the EU AI Act, which obviously won't apply to us because we're not in the EU, is going to set standards. And we've got to be aware of what those standards are, and we've got to be aware of the fact that the EU AI Act talks about risk and puts things into different risk buckets, and invariably any AI relating to the employment relationship is high risk. Okay, and that again tells us something for where we're meant to be going. So we've got to recognise the level of risk is high. I think we've then got to recognise that AI is fundamentally changing behaviours in work, and it's going to change the role of an HR team as well in terms of managing that. We're seeing different patterns of work emerge. Number one, so we see far more casual ask prompting of AI, and then the results being used in work. We are seeing a complete imbalance between the effort made to input into AI and then the effort required of the person who has got to process whatever that AI is. And we see that really with grievances and things like that now, many of which are generated by AI, and they have just enough space in them to suggest that there's some intelligence behind it, but most of it's gobbledygook. We've then got to look at how it's going to overlay risks that we've always had. The big one for me is around equality and diversity risks, bias in systems, and how you start to unpack systems to see where that bias is or where it should not be is absolutely key. And getting to grips with that is going to require a different skill set to what many people have had. So we've got that before we even get on to the consternation it's causing around job losses, job changes, and things like that. I'm seeing all the figures come through in terms of grievances and how long AI generated grievances are. Yeah, feel your pain on that. Really feel your pain.
It definitely seems to have people, sort of people in the chat, if you haven't seen it, saying grievances coming into the business being written by Copilot. I've had an ex-employee put multiple claims against us using AI. Their responses were drafted by ChatGPT. It's extremely difficult to have any negotiation with a chatbot. We have 17-page long grievance written by AI, same me, 26 points of grievance, all AI generated. Like you say, it is a significant drain on HR's time, capability, and also what needs to be escalated to unpick all of it.
Yeah, and I don't think we can underestimate how the conventional legal significance that AI will have. So in things such as equality and things such as performance management, all of these are going to be fundamentally affected very, very quickly by AI.
Yeah, there's a reference paper that's been generated by an AI expert that I know well, a chap called Dr. Richard Davies. He's prepared it specifically for HR leaders, and it's geared around governance maturity. Some excellent sources, some excellent statistics again that you can take to the board, some scenarios to stress test in your organisation, some recommendations, some 90-day recommendations. And I say this with, you know, there's nothing in it for me on this other than the fact that I want people to be able to try and get their heads around it. I'm going to share the document out. I'll share the document out straight after the session so that people have got it. I'll share it with the British team. They can share it on with you. But there's some definite work around. Again, it's where HR sits. What does HR have to own when it comes to AI? What does HR influence? You know, they can't control the whole data privacy side of the business. There is IT in that, and there is, you know, the legal team in that as well. And then it's actually, you know, sort of what is HR there to monitor? So again, I think sometimes we feel like we have to be, because it involves people, HR has to be responsible for all of it. And I think that it's understanding where our worlds intersect with other parts of our organisation around having a combined response.
Yeah, but I think there's a really interesting opportunity here for HR, which is ownership of HR, of AI in HR. And I don't think it should be a given that AI will be owned by HR. But you know, this is a real opportunity to grab hold of it and sit at the center of it and think, right, okay, before we introduce something, and we know systems like Workday, HiBob, etc., have AI built into them now, to actually think, right, we're going to control this governance process. We're going to be talking to IT in a sensible way about what's required. We're going to be talking to finance, etc., to make sure these things are robust. And I would really, you know, sort of encourage HR teams to get to grips with something which conceptually is really difficult and actually sits quite a long way from HR in many cases. But it's, you know, it's the future. In 2030, things are going to look very different.
Yeah, very much so. You know, I think I'm mindful that we're heading towards an hour, and I'm very grateful for people if they stay a little while longer, because I wanted to ask Matthew really about what does good governance look like in practice and not on paper in an organisation. If you know that because we've talked a lot about people that don't have good governance, and we don't have the what's going on, but actually, what does it look like? What does it feel like? What do you see in an organisation that has good governance?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. You say about the, you know, what does it look like in real life rather than on paper? But frankly, a lot of it's on paper. A lot of it is recording what you are going to do, understanding the risks of it, and then recording what you have done. So there is a lot of paper, and it's very difficult to avoid that. I think but it's what you do with the paper rather than just having it, you know, which is, if we go back to the example of the poor maligned line managers who we've talked an awful lot about, actually being able to explain to them how their decisions, often they're more instinctive, pragmatic decisions, translate in practice in terms of bits which are consistent with the organisation, but also things which might throw the organisation, you know, into a situation of unacceptable risk. I think it's really useful, and I think for many line managers who won't have necessarily gone into what they're doing because they want to manage people, they've ended up managing people, to be able to put the numbers, to be able to demonstrate how their decisions affect other things, I think is really important. So I would be looking at making sure you're recording the right things. I think one of the problems, and it goes back to this leading versus lagging indicators, is it can often look as if of these things just happen. They all happen to us. We haven't got any control over it. So actually going back to your leading indicators, those things which are recorded because someone has done something, I think it's a really positive thing as well. Like I say, if there was one small step to start with the indicator, which is we want every team leader to spend half an hour with HR or whatever it is every quarter or every 6 months, whatever, and just see what that has, what difference that has. That's the kind of thing I think where we need to start.
Because before making any key decisions, you need to know what you're working with. So putting some of those leading indicators in and seeing what happens now, seeing what happens naturally, without putting any other imposition over the top. And I appreciate that there's other legislation coming down the track. And I'm really sorry we haven't got to every question today. There was lots coming in. I think maybe Matthew and I can pick up some of those separately, and we can sort of respond to them, sort of with some additional video or some other content.
Yeah, definitely.
Lots of other points that came in. Now, we talked about if there's one risk HR leaders shouldn't ignore right now, what would that be? And I think that you raised that point earlier around the fact that what things are switching from being voluntary to being compulsory.
Yeah.
And I think that that's probably a massive key part. But I think that the last thing that I wanted to ask was really around HR influence. HR's influence. All we can do is advise and guide. We can't force it to happen. We can't, from my perspective, I would say this is where your HR business partners are so important, because they are the ones that are developing that relationship with senior leaders in the business, and they can be having those conversations around psychological safety, what people are happy to disclose, around what's culturally acceptable. If they've come in from a different organisation where risk wasn't really paid attention to, it's your business partner that's going to form that relationship. But for an HR professional who is having to try and create better influence at all points in their organisation, what could be one thing that they do next? What would be the next thing that they do?
Gosh, what's the next step? What would I suggest? I think there's a really good entry point into all of this, which is the Employment Rights Act. And I think it would be to not look at the Employment Rights Act, and this would be a theme you and I have discussed ad nauseum, Nina, but not to look at the Employment Rights Act as a load of separate things which just need to be implemented by HR, but instead to go to the board and say, I want you to see this strategically, structurally, and with a risk hat on. And to look at what the ERA means for that business from a risk perspective. I think, it's to a certain extent, the ERA is a fresh start. I was going to say it's a new chapter, but it's in many cases it's a new book, and we may as well embrace it and go on as we start as we mean to go on, by looking at it as risk and governance. So I think that would be a good starting point. And just a plug, we do have an ERA hub which has quite a lot of risk and governance materials on it. So so it's all there, but try to think, right, we're going to get the board thinking about this in the right way.
Risk. So I'm going to ask one last poll of people, please, because we'd like to know what your thinking is about what you're going to take away from the session. I'm sure you're thinking about lots of things about what's most important for you, but we're keen to see where your thinking lies as well. So what's your organisation's next step in improving people-related risk management? Where do you feel that time, effort, energy needs to be expended in order to help mitigate some of the risks, and also improve some of the governance that you have around all the different topics that we've talked about today? And I appreciate that it's been we could probably do a whole hour just in one small area. So we've tried to cover quite a lot in the time that we've had together today. So thank you for that. Just a few more votes coming in. Like I've said, I'll share the AI in HR risk documentation with the Pretty's team, so that can come out to you as well. And like Matthew said, the ERA hub is there to to support people all the way through, really. And there was questions in the chat earlier on about what are the dates for this, and I still think that there's some, not everyone's clear about the roadmap of what's going on. So I think that having that single point to be able to access will be a really, really powerful one for people. Lovely. Let's end the voting there, and we can share the results. So we've got a pretty clear direction of travel around strengthening manager capability and confidence, whether that is, from my perspective, before you think about coaching, development, like Matthew said, so many managers step into that managerial role because they're technically good at what they do, and actually being able to be pastorally great at what they do is so important, to be able to have those conversations, those difficult, challenging conversations. Again, that's the opportunity to test that in-house with your HR, with their HR team. Help them practice. It might feel a bit odd, but it'll feel even worse when they've got to do it in real life and they haven't had the opportunity to do so. So there's lots of areas of support. Obviously, Pretties have got all of the toolkits, all of the support there to be able to help you navigate the ERA. We're here to help you with some of that leadership capability, your line manager capability, those difficult conversations. It's a topic that I think is going to continue, particularly perhaps as the Fair Work Agency and some of the other parts of the ERA continue to bite. So, Matthew, if you're happy to kind of close us off for the morning.
Yep. Thank you, everybody. Really interesting chat. Thank you very much, Nina, for all the difficult questions. And as you said, we will go through the chat, and we'll come back in one way or another on those questions which we haven't been able to answer, as well as share the AI paper and other things with you. And if any of you are in need of some help with ERA, then you know where we are.
Lovely. Thank you very much, everyone. We really do appreciate it. Looking forward to seeing you again. We'll see you at a live event or another webinar very soon. Have a lovely day, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.